So, where do we go from here? We've learned a lot from our decades of experience trying to understand the relationship between communities and forests. But the addition of climate change to the mix means we have a new learning curve to ascend, and it can't be a leisurely climb. Just a few years ago, the authors of a review article on research on community forestry concluded, and I quote, "Community forestry in theory holds vast promise as a viable approach to forest conservation and forest community development. Gaps remain, however, between community forestry in theory and in practice." So imagine the review article 25 years from now. Gaps remain between read in theory and in practice. We don't have time for that. The authors of this same review article remarked, and I quote, "It may be too soon to evaluate fairly the social and economic outcomes of community forestry, as bringing about change in forest governance is a slow process." Okay, I admit that if you look up the word impatient in the dictionary, you'll find a little picture of me beside the definition. But surely you'll agree that with climate change already upon us, we've got to accelerate progress up that learning curve. How do we do that? I've got 3 suggestions. First, we need to do whatever we can to communicate what those of us in forestry world know about forests and communities to colleagues over there in climate world. Here, I pick up where Eduardo Rojas Briales of the FAO left off yesterday in his point stressing the importance of communications. We forget that what's already conventional wisdom to us are fresh insights to policy analysts and negotiators who came to climate debates from the energy sector or from financial institutions or from other non-forestry backgrounds. And let me tell you, it won't be very interesting to conduct research on how mistakes of the past have been repeated, so it's in our own self-interest to ensure that they're not. We've got to get out there in climate-related policy arenas and practitioner communities and push the research results that we already have in hand. We have to be relentless, and if possible, charming rather than boring, in stressing the significance of forests as contributors to rural livelihoods, the importance of secure rights and tenure, the importance of local institutions, the risks of excluding women and other marginalized groups, and the role of the broader political economy that can support or thwart real community management of forest resources. Now, a great opportunity to share such knowledge will be at a happy confluence of geography and timing when the UNFCCC COP16 meets in Cancun this December. The venue will make it possible to showcase experience with community forestry in Mexico and Central America to a captive audience people who otherwise inhabit climate world. You are all hereby invited to participate in the 4th Annual Forest Day on December 5th, whereas Niels has already mentioned, CIFOR and other members of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests are putting together a full slate of events to do just that. Second, we need to build our forest and climate research agenda on the foundation of what we've already learned from research on forests and communities. There are a lot of things we've learned on our progress up the learning curve that can speed our progress related to forests and climate change. In the new context of climate change, we need to understand the institutions and governance mechanisms needed to underpin solutions that yield effective, efficient, and equitable outcomes. How can RED and adaptation schemes find the optimal position between centralized and decentralized approaches? How do local property rights and other institutional variables influence the effectiveness of those approaches? What are the actual impacts of forest adaptation and mitigation actions on the rights and livelihoods of forest communities? How can the synergies be maximized and the trade-offs reduced? And as we stand on the mountainside and look back down, we can take heart from the progress already made on these questions before they were specifically posed in the context of climate change. But climate mitigation and adaptation actions also bring new questions. Will RED's innovation of payment for performance shape or be shaped by the pre-existing political economies of forestry? What institutions are the most supportive of community-level adaptation initiatives? And does it matter that climate mitigation and adaptation are now the overriding objectives of community forests? There's a lot of climbing to do, but I believe there's scope for accelerating our progress. One proposal that may be hopeless is to spend less time debating definitions. Let's define what red is for the purposes of research and get on with it. The second is to overthrow the tyranny of the case study. Let's not wait for case material to accumulate and then try to superimpose research design later. Instead, we can proactively work with policymakers and project designers to build in from the beginning features of red and adaptation interventions that will facilitate impact assessment later on. Let's not repeat the experience of integrated conservation and development projects. Those who've tried to draw lessons from that experience have struggled not only with very different approaches in different places, but in many cases, project approaches did not appear to be the result of well-thought-out design that made plausible linkages between interventions on the one hand and expected outcomes on the other. Compared to our colleagues in the health sector, for example, those of us in forestry world have done very few rigorous before, after, control, intervention, impact assessments. And it's time to up our game by engaging practitioners and helping them design interventions that can plausibly be evaluated later. And we need to ensure that livelihood and governance variables are measured along with carbon emissions. When it comes to forests and climate change, we will need to have robust answers to the question, what works, in more like 5 years rather than 25. Another way to accelerate progress will be to focus much more attention earlier on the broader political economy of forests and climate change. Our research needs to illuminate not only the underlying causes of deforestation and degradation, but also the interests that they serve and the institutions through which those interests operate, both formal and informal. Such analyses can help inform proponents of REDD and adaptation measures of the potential for unintended negative consequences. A lesson from the community forestry literature is that even well-intended interventions can serve to entrench vested interests and social injustice. But in many ways, it should be easier to include an explicit political economy dimension to our research this time around. Many topics, such as corruption and indigenous peoples' rights, that were difficult to even talk about in some countries just 10 years ago, are now on the table for discussion. To give you just one example, earlier this year, CIFOR published an analysis of the history of the Reforestation Fund in Indonesia and the lessons learned from that experience for financial management in future REDD schemes. In the past, such an analysis might have caused a serious rupture in our host country relationship, dealing as it did with the sensitive issue of corruption. But this time, our colleagues at the Ministry of Forestry welcomed the report and even contributed to a joint press release in which they embraced recommendations for increased transparency in the management of forest finances to avoid repeating those mistakes of the past.